Located deep in the American heartland is Lincoln, Nebraska, the state's capital.
People think of Nebraska as just kind of a flyover state with a lot of corn and cows and stuff. But being the capital and also being a college town, I think that Lincoln is a great place. It's small enough where you don't have terrible crime and such, but is not like a small town feel.
22-year-old Jennifer Hitchcock has called Lincoln home her whole life. Now a certified nurse's assistant, she's working hard to build a life here all her own.
You should have seen this little boy, Jacinta. Barely even 6 years old, and he broke his arm. Poor little guy.
Ouch. You know, my dad always said trampolines are like death traps. I mean, I'm sure you gave him some good TLC, though.
Jennifer and I met in junior high art class, and we just hit it off. She just has a way of making everything better and brighter. And it just translates naturally into her nursing.
He was so cute in his little cast and such a good patient, too.
Hey, Jen, wait up.
Hey, I gotta go. I'll call you later. Bye.
Hey, glad I caught you. I need a big favor. I got some tickets for a concert tomorrow night.
Why do I get the idea that you're not about to invite me to go?
Look, I told Beth I needed the night off, but she must have forgot. Could you cover for me tomorrow?
I'm working already, day shifts.
I know, but you're my last hope. Please. Yes. You're the best.
Jennifer had a rough time growing up. She was a foster kid, and she lived with her grandmother for some time, too. When you've had that sort of childhood where you're kind of broken, it seems like there are just people that latch onto that.
Working long hours is hard on Jen, but it has made it possible for her to purchase a home of her own.
Jennifer was not a typical 22-year-old woman. She was very independent. She was really proud of that. She was very happy to have her own place. She lived with a woman that she had been seeing for quite a while.
What are you doing?
Oh, my scrubs are dirty, and I won't have time to do them tomorrow, so.
You picked up another shift, didn't you? Who this time?
Nick.
That's 3 times this month. I mean, what, do you have a thing for him or something?
What? No, that's crazy.
Is it? I mean, for as much time as you spend at work, I've never even met one of your work friends. Like, is this even real?
Of course it is.
Then prove it. Let's have a party. Invite all your coworkers. Nick, everyone. That way they know it's real, too.
Okay.
Jennifer's family was never too accepting of her having an alternative sort of lifestyle. So there were little problems.
Jen goes forward with the party plan, and that Saturday night, all seems to go off without a hitch.
Hey! I wanted to meet somebody. This is Nick.
Hey.
Hey.
And this is his girlfriend, Stacy.
Hey, it's nice to meet you.
And this is my girlfriend, Amanda.
We were all pretty young, and there's always factors there. But I didn't think that there was anything that big going on that they wouldn't be able to work it out.
Cheers.
Cheers. Good to meet you.
Later that night, Jen strikes up a conversation with another party guest named Maurice Mason.
Oh my gosh, he's so cute. He's totally got your eyes.
Maurice was from Baraboo, Wisconsin. Maurice was 15 years older than Jennifer. He had a son who was still living in Wisconsin.
What did you say his name was again?
Tommy, named after my uncle.
He's adorable.
Excuse me, I need to talk to my girlfriend. Excuse me.
Yeah.
What the hell was that?
What was what? He was showing me a picture of his son.
Oh yeah, anything to get you to lean in real close. God, you're so stupid sometimes.
What? Amanda!
Over the next few weeks, Jen does her best to calm Amanda's concerns.
Wanna grab a latte? Do you want anything?
No thanks.
Oh, sorry.
Hey!
Hey, what are you doing here?
I was just walking by.
Oh.
Maurice kind of came out of nowhere.
This is kind of nice.
Oh.
You know?
Yeah.
Plain.
You gotta be kidding me.
Oh, hey, do you remember Maurice from the party? Seriously? Are you kidding?
I can't believe you embarrassed me like that.
Embarrassed you? Amanda, you embarrassed me. And yourself. Grabbing my arm like that? I'm not a child.
Yeah, then maybe you need to stop acting like one then.
That's it. I can't do this anymore. I think you should move out.
Finally, Jennifer ended things with the girlfriend. I was really surprised because I thought that they would always just kind of get back together again.
Freed from the weight of an overbearing relationship, Jen quickly settles back into the single life.
Hello?
Hi, it's Maurice.
Hey.
I hope you don't mind. My friend Jason gave me your number.
Oh, no. I don't mind.
I heard that you and Amanda broke up. Hope it wasn't anything I did.
No, it was a long time coming.
Oh. Well, in that case, what would you think about having dinner with me?
I think I'd like that.
I was surprised because he didn't seem like anything she would have been interested in. To me, this guy looked more like one of my dad's friends or something like that. But I figured if she liked him that much, that there must be something good about him.
Hey, what are you doing this weekend?
I don't know, maybe working?
Well, I'm going up to Wisconsin to see Tommy, and I was wondering if maybe you wanted to come with me. I've been telling him all about you.
You have?
Of course. You're amazing.
She wanted to have a family, and he seemed really focused on family as well. So it seemed like they were trying to get really serious really fast.
It's only a matter of weeks before Maurice moves in with Jen. But to her disappointment, she still spends some nights home alone.
Okay, I'm home. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I'm still here. So, how are things going with Maurice?
It's great. I love having him here, but it's hard because he's working all the time.
Everyone was obviously very happy for Jennifer in the beginning. Everything obviously was very wonderful, but Jennifer was not aware of somebody was watching her every movement.
At the home she shares with boyfriend Maurice Mason, 22-year-old Jennifer Hitchcock is now all alone.
Maurice was at work, and I had talked to her on the phone about him, but she didn't say a whole lot.
Okay, well, I better go so I can put these groceries away.
Okay, I'll talk to you later.
Okay, sounds good. Bye.
Hey, it's me. I gotta work late tonight. Probably won't be home till midnight.
Someone's trying to get into my house.
Ma'am, what's your address? Ma'am.
Thank God. I'm so sorry. It's just my boyfriend. False alarm. I thought you weren't going to be home until midnight.
Who are you going to see?
What?
I just saw you pull in.
Yeah, well, did you see the bag of groceries that I brought in? Are you being serious?
Don't change the subject. You shouldn't be leaving the house without me.
That's when it became obvious that he was definitely controlling. He wanted to always know what she was doing and who she was with.
You moved on from Amanda so damn quick. I don't want to be the last to know if you do the same to me.
Oh my God. You're just like her.
He seemed very dramatic. It seemed that he wasn't happy with anything, ever, no matter what she did.
Jen decides she's had enough and asks Maurice to move out.
She said something along the lines of, well, I love you, but I don't want to live with you. Things must have been pretty miserable for her to want him out of her life.
In the wake of yet another failed relationship, Jen spends the next few weeks busy at work. But weeks after the breakup, Jennifer is caught in a weak moment.
Hello?
Hey, it's me. I hope I'm not bothering you.
No, it's okay. Actually, I've missed you.
He was courting her again, and obviously not being as dominant and controlling as he had been in the past.
I know this might be crazy, but I was hoping I could ask you a really big favor. My car's in the shop, and I'm supposed to go see Tommy this weekend, and I was wondering if you could possibly give me a ride.
To Lake Delton? Isn't that like 10 hours from here?
I wouldn't ask, but you know how much he means to me.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, I could use the time away from work.
It wasn't long before he had convinced her that she should come back to Wisconsin with him so that they could see his son.
The next day, the 10-hour trip flies by without incident. Maurice suggests they settle into a hotel in Lake Delton.
I'm gonna give my aunt a quick call and let her know we made it.
Okay.
Alice was her aunt on her mother's side, and she really adored her. Things may not have been great in her family, but she did have a lot of relatives who cared a lot about her.
Hey, Aunt Alice. It's Jen. Just letting you know we made it to Lake Delton. Maurice is planning on meeting up with Tommy tomorrow, so it's probably going to be a few days before I'm back, but I'll let you know if anything changes. Okay, love you. Bye. So, what time are we planning on meeting up with Tommy tomorrow?
Well, that's up to my ex. She's gonna call me in the morning and let me know what her schedule is like. But I was thinking, since we're here, what do you say to pizza and watch a movie?
I imagine she had a terrible time telling him no, because as someone who is older, you know, he automatically has some authority. And because I'm sure she wanted to see where this guy came from and meet some of these relatives of his that he'd been talking about.
But 2 days pass without any progress in their plans.
Morning, sunshine.
Hey, morning.
I just spoke to Sue, and she apologizes, but she's really busy. Maybe tomorrow will work better.
Tomorrow, no, I have to work. Isn't there any way that we can meet sometime later tonight?
There didn't seem to be any plans for them to return to Nebraska. They certainly seem to be on two different pages.
Hey, let me have that.
Hey, we're having such a good time. Don't spoil it. Just a couple more days, and then we'll head home. Cool?
Sure.
He wasn't letting her make any of her own decisions at all. He was controlling her phone. He was listening, he was watching. She didn't have any privacy. It was definitely not what she signed up for.
Then, nearly a week after first arriving in Wisconsin, Jennifer finally sees a window of opportunity.
She must have been so scared because this man had her, you know, hundreds of miles from home, but she did have a cell phone.
And Alice, it's Jen. I'm still at Lake Dalton, but Maurice, he's acting crazy.
Why can't you just realize that we belong together?
It was just obvious that things were not okay. She wanted to come home, but she couldn't. It was really sad.
After receiving a disturbing call from 22-year-old Jennifer Hitchcock, her family has contacted police in the small Wisconsin town where she's been staying.
May we come in?
Hey, how you doing, officer? Can I help you?
The local police department did go looking for her and found her in that hotel with Maurice Mason.
Your family's concerned, Miss Hitchcock. We just need to know, is everything okay?
We just came up for a visit. We're both having a great time, right, Jen?
It's a situation where you want to get the person separated from the man to find out exactly what was going on and if she was there against her will and if any other crimes had occurred.
Jen, step outside with Mr. Mason. I'd like a moment alone with this young lady. Miss, are you in danger? You can press charges, you know, make sure he never comes near you again.
I just want to go home.
There was no way they were going to let Mason talk his way out of this one. There weren't any charges associated with this, but they could take her into protective custody, and that's what they did. Her aunt and uncle drove to Wisconsin, picked her up, and then they drove her back to Lincoln.
Back home, Jen does her best to settle into her regular routine. That is, until a few days later.
What?
I know you won't believe this, but I'm sorry, Jen. I shouldn't have done it. I just missed you so much. Please, just give me one more chance.
You've used all your chances.
Wait, don't hang up.
Maurice hadn't returned to Lincoln, Nebraska, and he was probably very charming and very attentive. It was jovial.
I found your watch. The one your grandma gave you. You left it in the motel in Wisconsin. How about I trade it to you for a ride to the garage, just so I can pick up my car?
Okay, fine. I'll be there at 5 p.m.
Great.
I really don't understand why she agreed to see this man again. We tried to tell her, don't meet up with him. And she's like, no, well, I'll at least talk to him.
But when Jen and Maurice arrive at the garage later that night, there's a problem.
Shoot. Forgot they close early on Wednesdays.
I suppose he was probably a pretty good actor in that sense. I'm sure she felt tricked.
Well, since we're here...
No. Maurice, no, it's over. No, I'm sorry, but this was a bad idea.
When Jennifer was taken away from Maurice's control, Maurice was furious, and he wasn't going to stand for it.
Shocking would that be to figure out that you are in the trunk of your own car? You have no idea where you are, no idea where you're going, or what has been done to you already, or what might happen to you.
The next morning, Jen is shocked to see that Maurice now has company.
Man, you really did a number on her. Help me get her out of here. We gotta clean her up.
Benny Fryer was actually Maurice's nephew. He's younger than Maurice, and it seemed to be a very passive personality. And he seemed to be almost under Maurice's control or direction. He did what Maurice told him to do.
Don't look good. Anyone sees her like this, they're gonna put me in jail. We gotta hide out for a little bit.
She looked so beat up. So his plan was to come back to Wisconsin, keep her out of sight, let her heal up.
Sorry, I can't take a chance on someone seeing you. That'll keep you warm.
It's like the ultimate betrayal, and it's switch and bait, you know? They reels her in and, you know, makes her think that he's this charismatic, friendly, great guy, and then he turns out to be this monster. And it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse.
Hours later, Jennifer wakes up to find the car is making an unexpected stop.
You gotta see this.
No!
Get out moving! Come on. Come on. Jen, meet my friend, David Klein.
Maurice Mason had sold marijuana to David Klein in the past. Maurice had decided that they were going to take Klein hostage. Klein had several $100s on him at that time, so they robbed him of his money. They tied his feet together and then wrapped his arms behind him around a post, making her realize that at any time she could be killed also.
Thanks for the loan, Dave. Here, take this. Buy a shotgun. We're gonna need one later.
She had to have known that nobody was going to find him. I mean, this wasn't an urban area. This was in the middle of nowhere. And I'm sure it just further cemented in her mind that she had to do what these people said if she was ever going to get out of this alive.
For the second time in a month, 22-year-old Jennifer Hitchcock is being held against her will at a motel in Lake Delton, Wisconsin.
What they did to David let her know what they were willing to do and how far they were willing to take things. And they basically left him for dead. He knows he can't let her go. Obviously, he wants to remain in control of her so that she can't get him in trouble for what he's done already.
The swelling is almost down, and I can cover the bruises with makeup. Can we go home now? I promise I won't say anything.
Just like last time, right? Where the hell have you been?
Our car's got a flat, and there's no spare. I had to leave it up the street.
Damn it!
We're in a pretty rural, isolated area, and they didn't have a car or any kind of transportation. So by this time, I think they're pretty desperate.
Calm down, all right? Look, I've been thinking, my brother lives in Baraboo. It's like 15 miles from here. I figured we could stay there with him at least till we get enough money to fix the tire.
All right, then. Tonight. We've been here long enough as it is.
Back in Lincoln, Jen's family has no idea she's even left town. But it's unlike Jen not to call and check in every few days, so they give her a ring.
Hi, this is Jen. Leave me a message.
Other than the fact that she went back with the person that they were concerned about, there probably wasn't that cause for alarm. There was no one that saw her get beaten up in that alley, so she wasn't reported as missing.
But Jen is in trouble, and without a phone to call for help, as she and her captors hit the road once again.
Hey, you guys call a cab?
Yeah, we're headed to Baraboo.
Hop in.
They've got this almost albatross with them, the fact that Jennifer was there in that condition and couldn't be seen in public. They didn't have a lot of options.
20 minutes later, the cab arrives in the town of Baraboo.
That'll be $27.50.
You guys go on ahead.
Get out.
They had no money and things weren't going as they had planned. Certainly things were becoming desperate.
What was that? I didn't hear nothing.
They would have heard it. Absolutely, they knew that he had just murdered the cab driver. It had to have been a real eye-opener for her, a real terrifying moment when she realized what Mason was capable of.
Are we almost there, man? Yeah, it's just about.
I mean, first you go from leaving someone for dead, and now you have someone actually dead. It's just getting worse. And where do you go after killing people? Definitely at this point, she knows that there's no turning back.
I'll come over here.
That evening, the group arrives at the home of Benny's brother Sam and his wife Crystal.
Hey, this is my girlfriend, Jen. She had a really bad accident. She doesn't like talking about it. She's feeling a lot better now, aren't you, honey?
Uh-huh.
They didn't know that the murder of the cab driver had occurred. They did, of course, see what shape that Jennifer was in. But in this case, blood was thicker than water, and they were going to be loyal to Fryer and Mason.
I'm going to bed.
There's a spare bedroom upstairs if one of y'all wants to sleep there.
No. I'll be fine right here. Thanks.
The beating was horrific, the time in the trunk, seeing these crimes occur, and also being with people. They had the ability to intervene, and they didn't. And I just can't imagine how demoralizing and frustrating that must have been to her.
She's not familiar with her surroundings to know where to go or how to find help. And she knows they'll find her.
Jennifer Hitchcock is trying to escape from her ex-boyfriend and his nephew, but there's a problem.
Where the hell are you going?
I gotta pee.
Bathroom's that way. You think I'm an idiot? Try that again and you're dead.
At this point, she's seen what these guys are willing to do, so she's scared to not comply. She's scared to go against their demands, and they're watching her.
By dawn, it's clear the duo is at the end of their rope as they hitch a ride into town, dragging Jennifer close behind.
Come on, let's take a walk.
Please.
There's this wooded area that's just kind of right in the middle of town almost, and up on a hillside. And they went up on that hillside and were absolutely isolated up there. Nobody goes up there, nobody walks around, there aren't trails there or anything like that.
Please let me go. I promise I won't. I won't say anything, please.
In the sequence over the last, several days, she had to know that she was in jeopardy.
So how much you get from the cabbie?
Nothing. Damn gun made too much noise. I had to split.
They were desperate, especially the lack of money, the lack of transportation. When they were up on that hillside, they were hungry and they were cold. No money, no good plan. Jennifer knew this.
For hours, the group walks deeper and deeper into the woods with no rhyme or reason as to where they are headed.
I gotta rest. Don't be trouble. Hold this.
Jennifer was sexually assaulted. She was sexually assaulted by Maurice Mason. Then Fryer said something to Mason about this being the last time that he'd be able to have sex, or he hadn't had sex in quite a while, and would it be all right for him to have sex with Jennifer? And Mason told him it would be. But in no way was that consensual. Clearly it wasn't.
It's then that Maurice's twisted plan takes its darkest turn yet.
We gotta put her out of her misery. She knows too much. You gotta do it. I can't.
Mason said that he was too much in love with Jennifer to actually kill her himself. He knew that he was going to go to prison, and he didn't want anybody else to be with Jennifer romantically. Mason said that Fryer was someone who would do whatever he asked him to do. He asked him to kill her, and Fryer did it.
Immediately, the two men take off through the woods, fleeing to a nearby hotel.
They run from that scene, and there's a clearing down that large hill, and then walk over to the Marriott Hotel. Benny and Maurice both ordered New York strips and shrimp and potatoes and salads, and their waiter came to them at the conclusion of the meal, and they told the waiter that they needed to call the police.
Middleton Police Department, can I help you?
Hi, this is Rob, head of security for the Marriott. I have a gentleman here who would like to speak with some police officers. He said it's of an emergency, personal nature.
Okay, didn't give any reason?
No.
Okay, we'll have an officer stop out.
They wanted to be arrested. They identified themselves, but wouldn't say what they had done, why they should be arrested. They only wanted to talk to detectives.
I arrested them both, and they were transported back to our police department. And I started by talking to Benny Fryer. And Benny just said to me that we've killed several people, and that's all I'm going to tell you. And Maurice started with a very similar statement, but he eventually told me about Jennifer, the cab driver that he had killed in Baraboo. And he gave me the information about David Klein, and he presumed Klein was dead. But Klein was found alive. He's still tied up, duct taped to the pole in the barn in the middle of nowhere. The lack of circulation to his hands, he had his both hands amputated as a result of this incident.
Maurice Mason eventually leads police to Jennifer Hitchcock's body. And in May 2005, he pleads guilty to all 3 crimes. He is sentenced to life in prison. Benny Fryer pleads no contest to first-degree reckless homicide in Jennifer Hitchcock's death and the reckless injury of David Klein. He is sentenced to 40 years in prison.
It's not fair that they are alive and they took the lives of others. Jennifer missed out on a lot. She really wanted to be a mother. I was really sad to have children, knowing that she didn't get to have any because she wanted children. And it makes me sad knowing that my children don't get to know her. You know, after someone's gone, you realize how you took them for granted.
Thank you for watching Investigation Discovery on Demand.
On a quiet stretch of U.S. Highway 25 in Kentucky, a man searching for discarded glass insulators noticed something that did not belong there. It was a bundle. Heavy. Unnatural. Wrapped in canvas and lying near the roadside. At first, there was no reason to believe it contained a human being. Then Wilbur Riddle moved closer. And everything changed. Inside the canvas was the badly decomposed body of a woman. She was naked. Her body had been wrapped in heavy green material and secured with twine. There was no identification. No pairs. No obvious explanation for who she was. And no one standing nearby to say what had happened. It was May 17th, 1968. The discovery was made in Scott County, Kentucky, roughly 13 miles north of Lexington. Within hours, the quiet roadside became a crime scene. Investigators began trying to reconstruct the final days of a woman whose name they did not know. But the body had already been exposed to the elements. Time had erased much of the evidence. What remained were fragments. Physical characteristics. Clothing, or rather, the absence of it. Hair. Teeth. Measurements. And a body that seemed to have been deliberately abandoned far from wherever the killing had occurred. The investigators estimated that the victim was between 16 and 19 years old. She stood approximately 5 feet 1 inch tall. She weighed somewhere between 110 and 115 pounds. Her hair was reddish-brown. That was almost everything they had. No name. No address. No family. No history. Just a dead woman beside a Kentucky highway. The public needed something to call her. So investigators gave her a name that was not really a name at all. Tent Girl. The nickname came from the strange canvas material wrapped around her body. It was believed to resemble material used in tents or canvas coverings. And that simple nickname would follow her for nearly 3 decades. At first, investigators searched for missing girls and women who might fit the description. They checked reports. They contacted surrounding jurisdictions. They released information to the public. A forensic artist produced a reconstruction of what the woman might have looked like alive. The image was eventually reproduced on the marker that would stand over her grave. The face became familiar, but nobody could put a name to it. And that was the first mystery. The second was much darker. Who killed her? There were no witnesses. No confession. No obvious weapon. No suspect who could be brought into an interrogation room and forced to explain the final hours of her life. The highway offered no answers. The body had been placed there. Someone had carried it. Someone had wrapped it. Someone had tied the canvas. Someone had driven or walked away. And yet, whoever did it seemed to disappear without leaving behind a trail investigators could follow. The case slowly became another cold case in a country filled with them. The woman was eventually buried in Georgetown Cemetery. But even in death, she remained anonymous. Her grave marker did not carry the name of a daughter. It did not carry the name of a wife. It did not carry the name of a mother. It carried only the name the public had given her. Tank Girl. Found May 17, 1968. Unidentified. Those words transformed a human being into a mystery. But somewhere else in Kentucky, a family had already been living with a different mystery. A young woman had disappeared. Her name was Barbara Ann Hackman. She was born in Illinois in 1943. She was known to her family as Bobby. She was married. She had a young daughter. And in late 1967, she vanished from Lexington. The family did not know where she had gone. They did not know why she had disappeared. And they did not know that months later, a nameless body would be found only a short distance away. The two stories existed separately. One belonged to a missing woman. The other belonged to an unidentified murder victim. For years, nobody understood that they were the same story. Barbara Ann Hackman had been 24 years old, but investigators looking at Tank Girl believed their victim was much younger. That difference mattered. It sent the investigation in the wrong direction. A woman in her 20s could be mistaken for a teenager. A missing wife could disappear from records more easily than a missing child. And if nobody officially reported her disappearance, the connection became even harder to see. Barbara's husband was George Earl Taylor. He worked as a carnival worker. And after Barbara disappeared, his explanation would become one of the most important pieces of the mystery. He told her family that Barbara had left him. According to accounts later given by relatives, she had supposedly run off with another man. Then she was gone. No body. No farguel. No confirmed destination. No phone call from Barbara. Nothing. The explanation might have remained accepted if the story had ended there. But it did not. Because several months later, a dead woman appeared beside a Kentucky road. And the woman in that canvas was approximately the same height as Barbara. She had reddish-brown hair. There were distinctive spaces between her front teeth. She had manicured nails. The physical details were quietly waiting for someone to notice them. But nobody did. Not in 1968. Not in 1969. Not in 1970. The case remained open, but the trail became colder. In 1971, with the victim still unidentified, she was buried in Georgetown Cemetery. The grave marker recorded everything investigators knew, and everything they did not know. Her approximate age, her height, her weight, her hair color, the date she was found, and one devastating word: unidentified. For a woman who had once had a mother, sisters, a husband, a child, a home, and a life, that single word became her official identity. Tank Girl. The years passed. The people who had investigated the case grew older. Some died. Some retired. Some simply moved on. The original crime scene changed. The roadside changed. Technology changed. America changed. But the woman in the cemetery remained frozen in 1968. There was no internet capable of connecting missing person reports across states. No massive searchable database. No modern forensic genealogy. No digital archive that could place a photograph from one family beside an unidentified body report from another county. There was only paper, telephone calls, police files, newspaper clippings, and memory. For decades, Tent Girl remained one of those cases that seemed destined to disappear into history. Then a young man heard about her. His name was Todd Matthews. He was not a detective. He was not a forensic scientist. He was not a police officer. He was simply someone who could not stop thinking about a dead woman whose name nobody knew. Matthews had learned about the case through Wilbur Riddle, the man who had discovered the body. The story stayed with him. The idea was disturbing. A woman had been murdered. Her body had been found. Yet nobody knew who she was. Nobody could tell her family where she was. Nobody could tell her child what had happened. And perhaps most disturbing of all, she could be buried in a cemetery, while the people who loved her continued searching for someone who was already dead. Matthews began investigating. At first, there was no reason to believe he would succeed. The case was already decades old. The records were scattered. The victim had been unidentified for so long that her nickname had become more recognizable than her face. But Matthews kept searching. He collected information. He studied the old descriptions. He looked at missing person reports. He tried to understand what investigators had known in 1968. Then the world began to change around him. The internet was becoming more accessible. People were beginning to post missing person information online. Names that had once been buried in newspaper archives could suddenly appear on computer screens thousands of miles away. For the first time, an unidentified body in Kentucky could be compared with a missing woman in another state without investigators having to physically exchange paper files. Matthews created a website dedicated to Tent Girl. The purpose was simple: give her story a larger audience, put her details where someone might recognize them, and hope. Hope that somewhere, someone would see the description and think of a woman who had disappeared. For years, nothing happened. Then, in the late 1990s, a message appeared online. It concerned a missing woman from Kentucky. Her name was Barbara Ann Hackman Taylor. And suddenly, details that had been separated for 30 years began moving toward each other. Barbara had disappeared from Lexington. Tent Girl had been found near Georgetown. Barbara was approximately 5 feet 1 inch tall. Tent Girl had been estimated at 5 feet 1 inch. Barbara had reddish-brown hair. Tent Girl had reddish-brown hair. Barbara had a distinctive gap between her front teeth. The unidentified woman had a similar dental characteristic recorded in the old investigation. The similarities were too strong to ignore. Matthews contacted Rosemary Westbrook, Barbara's sister. What followed was not a dramatic police raid. There were no flashing lights, no suspect in handcuffs, milk and fission. Instead, there was a photograph. A family photograph. A face. A memory. And a question that had waited nearly 30 years to be asked. Could Tent Girl actually be Barbara Ann Hackman? The possibility was terrifying. Because if the answer was yes, then Barbara had not simply disappeared. She had been murdered. And someone had known. Someone had carried her body to that roadside. Someone had wrapped her in canvas. Someone had left her there. For 30 years, Barbara's family had lived without knowing where she was. For 30 years, her daughter had grown up without her mother. For 30 years, the grave in Georgetown Cemetery carried the wrong name. Now, for the first time, the old mystery had a face. and investigators were forced to confront a possibility that could change everything. The woman called Tent Girl might finally have a name, but a name would not answer the most important question: who killed Barbara and Hackman Taylor? And by the time that question became clear, the man investigators would eventually regard as the prime suspect was already dead. The killer, if it was him, had taken the final answer to the grave. And the truth had been waiting there for nearly 3 decades. The cemetery became quieter after the ceremony. The reporters left. The cameras disappeared. The flowers slowly faded. And the people who had spent years searching for Barbara eventually had to return to ordinary life. But the case itself never became ordinary again. For decades, Tent Girl had represented a woman without a name. Now the name was known: Barbara and Hackman. The mystery had changed shape. And perhaps that was the strangest thing of all. When a cold case is solved, people expect the darkness to disappear. They expect the final revelation to bring peace. But sometimes identification creates an entirely different kind of silence. Because once the victim has a name, every unanswered question becomes more personal. Before 1998, investigators were searching for an unknown woman. After 1998, they were confronting the death of Barbara. Every detail carried greater weight. Every missing piece became more painful. The canvas was no longer wrapped around an unidentified body. It had been wrapped around Barbara. The roadside was no longer the place where Tent Girl was discovered. It was the place where Barbara's story had been interrupted. The cemetery was no longer the resting place of a mystery. It was where Barbara had waited for her family to find her. That transformation was impossible to reverse. And perhaps that is why her story continued to attract attention. The case had survived because the woman had survived in memory. Not physically. Not in photographs alone. But in the determination of people who refused to let her disappear completely. The early investigators could not solve the identity. Technology eventually could. But technology needed someone to ask the question: what if the unidentified woman was connected to someone who had been missing? That question changed everything. It is easy to imagine a cold case as a locked room. The evidence is inside. The investigators are outside. The door will not open. But Barbara's case was different. The key existed. It was simply in another room. That key was her family's memory. Her photograph. Her missing person history. The details of her appearance. And eventually, DNA. The door opened decades later. But once it opened, another room appeared behind it. The murder. And that room remained dark. The identity of the victim could be proven. The responsibility for her death could not. That distinction became permanent. There would be no courtroom ending. No jury deliberation. No verdict. No final statement from the person police suspected. George Earl Taylor had already died. Whatever he knew about Barbara's final hours disappeared with him. That fact is one of the most painful elements of the entire case. Because the investigation eventually reached a point where the past was accessible again. But the person who might have explained it was not. Investigators could reconstruct fragments. They could examine old statements. They could examine the circumstances. They could compare timelines. They could consider the evidence that had survived. But they could never place Taylor in an interrogation room in 1998 and ask him the questions that had been impossible to ask in 1968. That opportunity had vanished. And so did the possibility of a definitive confession. There is a temptation in stories like this to imagine what a confession might have sounded like. But there was never one. There is no verified final statement. No documented admission. No courtroom testimony. Only the historical record and the unanswered questions surrounding Barbara's disappearance. That is where responsible investigation must stop. The case can identify suspicion. It cannot manufacture certainty. And yet the absence of a conviction does not make Barbara's death less real. She was murdered. Her body was abandoned. Her family lost her. Her daughter grew up without her mother. Those facts do not depend on a courtroom ending. What remains unresolved is the identity of the person legally responsible. That difference may frustrate anyone looking for a perfect conclusion. But cold cases rarely provide perfect conclusions. Sometimes they provide fragments. Sometimes they provide names. Sometimes they provide graves. Sometimes they provide only enough truth to allow a family to stop wondering. Barbara's family received that truth. They finally knew. And perhaps, after 30 years, knowing mattered more than anything else. There is a quiet cruelty in the way her identity was recovered. The world had been searching for Tent Girl. Her family had been searching for Barbara. They were searching for the same woman without realizing it. For years, the two searches moved separately. Then, almost by accident, they collided. The result was one of the most memorable unidentified person identifications of its era. A case that began beside a Kentucky highway became an early demonstration of the power of the internet. A mystery that had survived for decades became a lesson in persistence. And a woman who had been reduced to 2 words finally received her full name. Barbara Ann Hackman. The name was longer than the nickname, but it carried an entire life. A childhood. A family. A marriage. A daughter. Memories. Photographs. Dreams. Plans. And then a disappearance. That is what the nickname could never tell anyone. Tent Girl sounded like a mystery. Barbara was a person. That distinction is why her story should never be reduced to the circumstances of her death. The murder was horrific. The investigation was extraordinary. The identification was remarkable. But the most important fact is still the simplest. She existed. She was loved. She was missed. And someone kept searching. The cemetery remains a symbol of that search. A place where the unknown became known. A place where the old mystery and the recovered identity now exist side by side. Visitors can still see the history written into stone. One name belongs to the mystery. One belongs to the woman. The old identity cannot be erased. It is part of the history, but it no longer defines her. Barbara does. And perhaps that is the final lesson of the case. A killer can take a life. Time can erase evidence. A system can lose information. A body can become unidentified. A grave can carry the wrong name for decades. But identity can survive. Memory can survive. And sometimes, against extraordinary odds, the truth can survive too. Barbara's story proves that. It also leaves a warning. Every unidentified victim is someone's missing person. Every Jane Doe may have a family somewhere. Every unidentified body may have a name waiting to be recovered. The question is not whether the information exists. Sometimes it does. The question is whether someone will connect it. In Barbara's case, someone did. 30 years later. Too late to prosecute, but not too late to remember. And perhaps that is why the name Barbara Ann Hackman continues to matter. Because the killer may have disappeared into history. The evidence may have grown old. The witnesses may be gone. But Barbara is no longer a nameless woman beside a Kentucky highway. She has a name. She has a grave. She has a family history. And she has a story. A story that began with a roadside discovery. A story that passed through decades of silence. A story that survived the death of the prime suspect. A story that was reopened by a determined researcher. A story confirmed by science. And a story that ultimately delivered one thing that had been missing for 30 years. The truth of who she was. Barbara. Not Tank Girl. Barbara. And somewhere beyond the unanswered questions, beyond the old photographs and the fading newspaper articles, that name remains. A reminder that even when a case goes cold, the person at its center does not disappear. She waits. In records. In memories. In photographs. In graves. In the stories families refuse to stop telling. For Barbara, someone finally heard that story. And after 48 years from the original disappearance era, and decades after the discovery that made her famous, the woman once known only as Tank Girl was finally returned to the identity that had always belonged to her. Barbara Ann Hackman. Her killer remains unresolved. Her story does not. The story of Barbara Ann Hackman did not truly end when the DNA result came back. In some ways, that was when the most difficult part began. For 3 decades, the question had been simple. Who was Tank Girl? The answer finally came. Barbara Ann Hackman. But once the name was known, another question became impossible to ignore. What happened to her? That question had always existed. It had simply been hidden behind the mystery of her identity. Now there was no longer anywhere for it to hide. Barbara had disappeared. Her body had been discovered. She had been murdered. And someone had been responsible. The investigation had to confront the uncomfortable reality that the most important person connected to the mystery was already dead. George Earl Taylor was gone. There would be no interrogation. No confrontación. No opportunity to place him in front of investigators and ask why Barbara disappeared. No chance to compare his answers with evidence uncovered 30 years later. No chance to hear him explain the canvas. No chance to ask where he had been. No chance to ask when he had last seen Barbara alive. The passage of time had created an irreversible barrier. The investigation could move forward, but it could never move backward. That is the cruelty of a cold case. The evidence may survive. The people may not. And when people disappear from the investigation, entire explanations disappear with them. Barbara's family had spent years living with one explanation. She had left. She had supposedly gone away. Maybe she had chosen another life. Maybe she did not want to be found. Those possibilities had been painful. But they had left the door open. A door that could never completely close. Then the discovery of Tank Girl slammed it shut. Barbara had not simply walked away. She had died. And her body had been found less than a year after her disappearance. The reality was far darker than anything her family had been told. That realization changed the meaning of every memory, every conversation, every unanswered question, every moment when someone had wondered where Barbara was. The family could finally stop imagining her somewhere far away. But they had to begin imagining something else. Her final hours. Those hours remain one of the great unanswered pieces of the case. There is no complete public reconstruction, no definitive account of what happened immediately before Barbara died, no confirmed explanation for the precise location of her death, no verified account explaining why her body was wrapped and abandoned. There are theories. There are circumstances. There is suspicion. But there is no final judicial answer. That distinction matters because Barbara's story has been repeated for decades. And every time a cold case becomes famous, facts and speculation can become intertwined. The documented facts are powerful enough, without invention. A woman disappeared. A body was found. The body remained unidentified. A family was searching. A researcher connected the cases. DNA confirmed the identity. Investigators focused suspicion on Taylor. Taylor died before the identification. No one was convicted. Those facts alone tell an extraordinary story. There is no need to manufacture a confession that never happened. There is no need to invent a final confrontation that never occurred. The silence is part of the truth. And perhaps the silence is what makes the case so disturbing. Because the woman at the center of the story never had the opportunity to tell anyone what happened. Barbara's voice disappeared with her. For decades, the only voice left was the voice of investigators, the voice of newspapers, the voice of relatives, the voice of people searching for answers. But Barbara herself could never speak. That is why identification was so important. It did not simply provide a name. It restored a history. The unknown woman now had a family. She had a daughter. She had sisters. She had photographs. She had memories. She had a past. The body was no longer an isolated piece of evidence. It was Barbara. That realization carries enormous weight. Because a crime scene tells you how a person was found. A family tells you who that person was. Barbara was more than the circumstances of her death. She had lived for 24 years before the world knew her as Tent Girl. 24 years of ordinary experiences. Birthdays. Family gatherings. Childhood memories. Marriage. Motherhood. Arguments. Laughter. Plans. The crime reduced those years to a single headline, but the family remembered everything that came before. That memory became another form of evidence. Not evidence that could identify a killer, but evidence that could restore humanity. And perhaps that is why the case remains so memorable. It is not merely a story about an unidentified body. It is a story about the recovery of a stolen identity. Someone had taken Barbara's life. Someone had taken her future. But for 30 years, the world also lost her name. The identification gave that name back. There is something almost symbolic about the timeline. 1968. A body discovered. A mystery begins. 1971. An unknown woman is buried. 1987. The prime suspect dies. 1998. Barbara is finally identified. The dates form a chain. And the chain reveals the terrible irony. The person investigators most wanted to question was gone before the victim could even be identified. The family finally received an answer 11 years too late. That is the kind of timing that defines cold cases. One discovery arrives after another opportunity has disappeared. A breakthrough opens one door. Behind it is another locked door. Barbara's identity was the first door. Her killer was the second. The first opened. The second remained closed. And perhaps it always will. Still, something changed permanently in 1998. Barbara was no longer missing. Her family could stop searching. The grave could carry her name. Her daughter could know where her mother was buried. Her sisters could finally mourn without uncertainty. The community could replace the nickname with the real identity. And the story could be told correctly. Not perfectly, but correctly. That difference matters. Because justice is not always the same thing as closure. Closure does not require every question to have an answer. Sometimes closure means knowing the person is no longer missing. Sometimes it means knowing where to place flowers. Sometimes it means being able to say a name without wondering whether the person might still be alive. Barbara's family received that kind of closure. The homicide itself did not. That distinction may never disappear. Years later, the case still represents one of the most haunting examples of how unidentified victims can remain hidden in plain sight. The body was not hidden forever. It had been found. The grave was not hidden forever. People knew where it was. The identity was the missing piece. Once the identity was restored, the story became visible. That lesson extended far beyond Barbara. There were other unidentified victims, other families waiting, other graves carrying temporary names, other people whose identities had been separated from their remains. The work inspired by cases like Tank Girl helped demonstrate the importance of connecting missing person records with unidentified remains. The internet became a tool. DNA became a tool. Public participation became a tool. And each tool carried the same basic message. A person should not disappear simply because decades have passed. Barbara proved that. She waited 30 years. Someone finally found her. But there is another message buried inside the case. Finding a victim is not the same as finding justice. The identification solved one mystery. It did not solve the homicide. And that means the story remains unfinished in a very specific way. Barbara has her name. She has her grave. She has her history. But she does not have a proven killer. The person investigators suspected is dead. The case has no courtroom ending. No final verdict. No sentence. The last chapter remains unwritten. Perhaps that is why the old name, Tank Girl, still echoes. Not because Barbara is unidentified. She is not. But because the nickname represents the question that remained after her real name was recovered. If she was Barbara, who left her there? Who wrapped her body? Who drove away? Who knew? Who remained silent? Those questions may never be answered. The road will continue to carry traffic. The cemetery will continue to grow quiet. Flowers will fade. Old newspaper pages will yellow. Photographs will age. But the name will remain. Barbara and Hackman. That is what time could not erase. The murderer may have escaped the courtroom. The evidence may have weakened. The witnesses may have disappeared. But Barbara's identity survived. And perhaps that is the final measure of what was recovered. Not everything, but something. Enough to tell her family. She was here. She was real. She was loved. She was found. For 30 years, the world called her Tank Girl. Now history knows her as Barbara. And beneath the quiet stone in Georgetown Cemetery, the mystery has finally been separated from the woman. The mystery remains. The woman has her name. The name Barbara and Hackman now stands where uncertainty once stood. But names do not erase what happened. They only make the loss more real. For 30 years, people could look at the grave and wonder who the woman had been. After the identification, there was no mystery about that anymore. She had a family. She had a daughter. She had sisters who remembered her. She had a life that existed before the roadside discovery. And somewhere between that life and the moment her body was found, something terrible happened. That missing stretch of time remains the darkest part of the story. There are no surviving recordings of Barbara's final conversations. No complete eyewitness account. No definitive timeline that explains every movement. No final message from Barbara telling anyone where she was going. Her disappearance created a void. The discovery of her body filled only part of it. Investigators could finally say who the victim was. They could not reconstruct every moment that led to her death. That is the difference between identifying a victim and solving a homicide. The first requires finding the right connection. The second requires proving what happened. And proof becomes harder when decades have passed. In 1968, investigators had no idea they were standing over the remains of Barbara. They believed they were looking at an unknown young woman. That assumption shaped everything that followed. The wrong age estimate meant the wrong missing person cases could receive attention. The lack of identification meant Barbara's family could not be connected to the body. The passage of time then buried the case deeper. By the time technology finally created a bridge between the two stories, much of the original investigation was history. The people who knew the most had aged. Some were gone. The suspect was gone, and the evidence had been exposed to decades of deterioration. Still, the case refused to disappear. That is perhaps its most remarkable feature. It should have faded. Many cold cases do. The newspaper stories disappear from front pages. The investigators retire. The files move into storage. The families grow tired. The public forgets. But Tank Girl remained. The nickname was strange enough to be remembered. The discovery was disturbing enough to survive in local memory. The grave remained visible. And the question remained simple. Who was she? That question eventually reached someone who refused to let it go. Todd Matthews became part of the story not because he possessed a secret piece of evidence, but because he continued looking when there was no guarantee that looking would accomplish anything. That persistence matters. Cold cases rarely reward people quickly. Sometimes there is nothing for years. Then one detail changes everything. A photograph. A name. A family member. A record. A DNA match. The breakthrough can look sudden from the outside, but behind it may be years of searching. Barbara's identification was like that. The final confirmation came quickly. The path toward it did not. And when the DNA result finally established that Tank Girl was Barbara, the mystery of identity disappeared almost instantly. There was no longer any reasonable doubt about who the woman was. But the identification also created a strange emotional reversal. For years, Barbara's family had been asking where she was. Now they knew. She was buried in Georgetown. She had been there for decades. The answer was both devastating and merciful. They could stop wondering. They could stop searching. They could stop imagining her living somewhere beyond their reach. But they could never ask her what happened. That question belonged to the dead. And the dead do not answer. This is the part of cold case stories that is often lost beneath headlines. The family does not simply receive a case number. They receive a reality. A person they hope might still be alive is confirmed dead. A missing person investigation becomes a homicide investigation. Hope becomes grief. And uncertainty becomes memory. Barbara's family had to confront that transformation. The woman they had been missing had not chosen to disappear. She had been killed. That knowledge was painful, but it also restored the truth. For decades, Barbara had been represented by an explanation that suggested choice. She had left. Now the evidence told a different story. Her body had been found. She had been buried under an unidentified name. Her family had never been given the truth. And the person investigators suspected was no longer alive to answer questions. The circumstances surrounding George Earl Taylor remain an essential but unresolved part of the case. He was considered the prime suspect. That does not mean guilt was proven. He was never convicted. His death prevented a trial. That distinction must remain clear. Cold cases can generate powerful theories, but theories cannot replace evidence. And when the central suspect is dead, the possibility of a definitive legal conclusion becomes even more difficult. That is why Barbara's story should not be forced into a conclusion it never received. The honest ending is uncomfortable. She was identified. Her family learned the truth. A suspect was identified, but no one was convicted. The murder remains without a definitive judicial resolution. That is the reality. And reality can be more disturbing than fiction, because fiction gives the audience an ending. Real life sometimes does not. Real life leaves the question hanging. It leaves the cemetery quiet. It leaves the highway unchanged. It leaves families carrying answers that are incomplete. Barbara's case is one of those stories. It does not end with justice arriving at the door. It ends with a name returning to a grave. That may sound small. It is not. A name can be a form of restoration. For 30 years, the woman buried there could not be properly mourned by the people who loved her. The family knew Barbara existed, but they did not know where she was. The cemetery knew where the body was, but it did not know her name. The two halves of the truth were separated. The identification brought them together. Barbara was finally where she belonged, not because she was alive, but because her identity had been restored. Her family could visit. They could speak to her. They could bring flowers. They could tell stories. They could teach younger relatives about the woman whose life had been interrupted. The crime had taken Barbara's future. It could not take every memory of her. That is why the photograph matters. A photograph freezes a person before the tragedy. It shows Barbara alive. Not as a body. Not as Tent Girl. Not as a forensic reconstruction. As Barbara. That image carries something the crime scene never could. Humanity. The body beside the highway told investigators that someone had died. The photograph told them who had lived. Those two images eventually became part of the same story. And that is the story that survives. A woman disappeared. A body was found. A name was lost. A grave was created. A family waited. A researcher searched. Technology connected the pieces. DNA confirmed the truth. And then the case stopped. Not because every question had been answered. Because time had taken too much. The killer was never brought before a court. The final sequence of events remains uncertain. The silence surrounding Barbara's death remains. But her name no longer does. That is why the phrase "Tent Girl" should be understood carefully. It belongs to the history of the investigation. It belongs to the years when nobody knew who she was. But it should never replace Barbara. Tent Girl was a label created by uncertainty. Barbara was the woman. That woman had a family. She had memories. She had a child. She had a name. And after nearly 3 decades of anonymity, she got it back. There is something profoundly unsettling about knowing that the answer had been waiting so close to the surface. The family was searching. The body was already in a cemetery. The information existed, but nobody could connect them. 30 years separated recognition from discovery. 30 years in which the wrong question was being asked. Who is Tent Girl? The better question had always been, which missing woman is lying beneath that grave? Once that question was asked, the case began to move. That is the legacy of Barbara's identification. It demonstrated that old cases are not necessarily dead cases. They can remain dormant. They can wait for technology. They can wait for new information. They can wait for someone who refuses to accept the word unidentified. Barbara waited. Her family waited. The grave waited. And eventually, someone found the connection. But there is one final irony. The identification that brought Barbara home also made the remaining mystery more painful. Before 1998, there was a possibility that Tent Girl's death had been caused by someone unknown. After 1998, the family knew exactly whose death they were trying to understand. The victim had a name. The suspect had a name. But the bridge between them remained incomplete. That is where the case still stands. A woman named Barbara Ann Hackman was murdered. Her identity was recovered decades later. Her family finally knew where she was. The man investigators regarded as the prime suspect had already died. No conviction followed. No definitive confession emerged. No final explanation closed every gap. The grave remains. The name remains. And the question remains: who killed Barbara? For some mysteries, the answer is hidden in a document. For others, it is hidden in DNA. For Barbara, one mystery was solved through those tools. The other may remain forever beyond reach. But there is something the passage of time could not destroy. Her identity. Barbara Ann Hackman. That is the name that survived the highway. It survived the cemetery. It survived the decades. It survived the death of the prime suspect. It survived the silence. And now, whenever the story of Tent Girl is told, the mystery begins and ends with the same truth. She was never just Tent Girl. She was Barbara. She was 24 years old. She was someone's daughter. Someone's sister. Someone's mother. Someone's reason to keep searching. And after all those years, the search finally found her. The world could not give Barbara her life back. It could not undo the crime. It could not guarantee justice. But it could give her name back. And sometimes, in a cold case that has survived for generations, that is the first and most important thing that must be recovered. The name. The memory. The person. Barbara Ann Hackman. Not unidentified. Not forgotten. Not lost anymore. Only the final answer remains. The grave is quiet now. There are no crowds. No flashing cameras. No investigators standing around the cemetery. No reporters waiting for a new development. Only stone. And the name carved into it. Barbara Ann Hackman. For years, that name existed separately from the woman buried beneath the ground. Her family knew the name. The cemetery held the body. The investigators held the case file. The public knew the nickname. None of those pieces belonged together. Until they did. That moment changed the case forever. But it did not change the past. Barbara still disappeared in 1967. Her body was still discovered in 1968. She was still buried as an unidentified woman. And the person responsible for her death was still never convicted. The clock could not be turned backward. That is the cruel mathematics of a cold case. 30 years can produce an identification. 30 years can also destroy the possibility of prosecution. One discovery can arrive just in time. Another can arrive too late. Barbara's story contains both. The DNA came at the right moment to give her family an answer. But it came too late to put the prime suspect on trial. That contradiction remains at the center of everything. The woman was finally found. The man suspected of killing her was already gone. And the questions that mattered most remained suspended between those two facts. For decades, people had looked at Tent Girl as a mystery. The nickname itself sounded almost unreal. It reduced the case to the strangest detail surrounding the body. But there was nothing mysterious about the fact that she had once been someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's mother. Barbara had lived an ordinary life before becoming the subject of an extraordinary investigation. She had plans. She had relationships. She had a child. She had people who expected to see her again. Then she disappeared. That disappearance became a wound in her family. The years did not heal it. They simply made the wound older. Every birthday that passed was another reminder. Every holiday was another empty place. Every family photograph contained someone who was no longer there. And somewhere in Kentucky, the answer was already underground. That is perhaps the most haunting realization. The family did not need to search across the entire country. They did not need to search another continent. They did not need to imagine an unknown future. Barbara was already in a cemetery. The problem was that nobody knew it. Her body had been discovered. Her grave had been marked. People knew where Tank Girl was. They simply did not know who she was. That distinction kept the family separated from her for decades. Then the internet changed the investigation. A case that had once existed inside paper files could now be shared with strangers. A photograph could be seen by someone who had never heard of Tank Girl. A missing person record could suddenly intersect with an unidentified body. A researcher could search at midnight from a computer instead of waiting for an agency to answer a telephone call. The technology was new. The principle was ancient. Someone cared enough to keep looking. Todd Matthews became part of that process. He did not know what the final result would be. He could not know whether Tank Girl would ever be identified. He could not know whether a family would recognize her. He could not know whether DNA would confirm the connection. But he continued. That persistence created the possibility of an answer. And when Barbara's family finally learned the truth, decades of uncertainty collapsed into one devastating fact. Tank Girl was Barbara. The unidentified woman had a name. The missing woman had a grave. The family had found her. But the identification created another kind of responsibility. Now that Barbara had a name, her death could no longer be treated as an abstract mystery. She had been murdered. Someone had taken her life. Someone had abandoned her body. Someone had allowed her family to believe that she had simply disappeared. And investigators believed they knew who might have been responsible. George Earl Taylor. But suspicion is where the certainty ends. Taylor was never convicted. He died in 1987. The identification came 11 years later. That timeline cannot be changed. There would be no trial, no jury, no verdict, no sentence, and no opportunity to ask him the questions that had become more important after Barbara was identified. That is why the case remains unresolved. Not because investigators do not know Barbara's identity. They do. Not because there is no suspect. There was one. But because the evidence never reached the point of a definitive legal conclusion. This is an uncomfortable truth. People want cold cases to end cleanly. They want a final scene, a confession, a courtroom, a conviction. But real investigations do not always provide those things. Sometimes the strongest conclusion available is incomplete. Barbara was identified. Her family received her remains. The prime suspect was known. But the legal system never established responsibility. That is where the historical record must stop. Anything beyond that becomes speculation. And Barbara deserves better than speculation. She deserves to be remembered through what is known. She was Barbara Ann Hackman. She was 24. she disappeared. Her body was discovered near a Kentucky highway. She was buried under the name Tent Girl. 30 years later, DNA confirmed her identity. Her family finally learned where she had been. Those facts are enough to understand the magnitude of what happened. The rest remains hidden. Perhaps somewhere there are memories that were never shared. Perhaps someone knew something and remained silent. Perhaps evidence once existed that could have changed the investigation. Perhaps the final answer disappeared when the people who possessed it died. Or perhaps the surviving evidence was never enough. No one can say with certainty. That uncertainty is not weakness. It is the truth. And truth is what separates a documentary from a legend. Barbara's story has already accumulated decades of retelling. Every generation adds another layer. The original investigators remembered one version. The family remembered another. Researchers uncovered old records. The internet created new connections. Modern audiences encounter the case through documentaries, articles, and online databases. Each generation looked at the same mystery from a different angle. But the grave remained unchanged. Barbara's name remained. And the central question remained. Who killed her? There is something almost unbearable about that question, because the answer may once have been within reach. Perhaps someone knew. Perhaps someone could have spoken. Perhaps a single conversation could have changed the investigation. Perhaps an earlier identification could have changed everything. But history does not operate on possibilities. It operates on what actually happened. Barbara was not identified until 1998. Taylor was already dead. The case had passed the point where certain questions could be answered. And yet, the identification still mattered enormously. Because before that moment, Barbara was missing. After it, she was found. Before that moment, her family could wonder whether she was alive. After it, they knew. Before that moment, Tent Girl was an unidentified body. After it, she was Barbara. That transformation cannot be underestimated. For families of missing people, uncertainty can be a form of imprisonment. They remain trapped between hope and grief. They cannot properly mourn. They cannot fully move forward. They do not know whether to wait or let go. Barbara's family lived inside that uncertainty. The DNA result finally released them from it. Not into happiness, into truth. And truth can be painful, but it can also be liberating. Barbara could finally be mourned as herself. Her family could finally stand at her grave and say her name. They could finally tell the story of where she had been. They could finally explain why she had never returned. She had not simply chosen to disappear. She had been murdered. That knowledge would always hurt, but at least it was knowledge. The old marker had once represented a question. The new marker represented an answer. The cemetery itself became a historical document. One stone showing the mystery. One stone showing the truth. And beneath both was the same woman. Barbara. That name is stronger than the nickname. Because the nickname came from strangers. Barbara came from the people who loved her. That is the identity that should remain. Not the canvas. Not the roadside. Not the mystery. Not even the suspect. Barbara. A human being who had a life before the crime. A person who should have grown older. A mother who should have watched her child grow. A sister who should have attended family gatherings. A woman whose future was stolen. The killer, whoever was ultimately responsible, could take away her future. But he could not erase her past forever. The past survived in photographs. It survived in family memories. It survived in records. It survived in DNA. And eventually, it survived in her grave. The woman, once called Tent Girl, finally received the one thing she had been denied for 30 years. Her own name. Barbara Ann Hackman. The investigation may never provide the final answer. The killer may never stand before a judge. The circumstances of those final hours may remain partly hidden. But the woman herself is no longer hidden. Her family found her. History found her. And the world finally learned who had been waiting beneath that Kentucky soil. The case began with a body nobody could identify. It continued with a family that refused to forget. It moved forward through technology and persistence. And it reached its greatest breakthrough when science confirmed what memory had suspected. The mystery of the victim was solved. The mystery of the killer was not. That distinction will remain forever attached to Barbara's story. But so will something else. Her name. Barbara Ann Hackman. A name that survived 30 years of silence. A name that survived an unidentified grave. A name that survived the death of the man investigators considered the prime suspect. A name that survived time itself. And perhaps that is the final image the case leaves behind. Not the canvas. Not the highway. Not the unanswered accusation. A quiet cemetery. An old stone. A newer stone. And a name that finally belongs where it always should have. Barbara Ann Hackman. The woman once known as Tent Girl is no longer a mystery. Only her murder is. And somewhere in the silence left behind, that final question remains. Who killed Barbara? No answer has closed it. No verdict has ended it. No confession has silenced it. It remains there, suspended between the past and the present. But Barbara's name no longer waits for anyone. It has already been found. The silence surrounding Barbara did not begin in the cemetery. It began much earlier. It began the moment no one could explain where she had gone. At first, a disappearance can feel temporary. A missed phone call. A delayed return. A person who is expected home but does not arrive. Families tell themselves there must be a reason. Perhaps she changed her plans. Perhaps she needed time. Perhaps she would walk through the door tomorrow. Then tomorrow becomes another day. Another day becomes a week. A week becomes a month. And eventually, the waiting itself becomes part of life. For Barbara's family, that waiting lasted for years. They did not know that somewhere in Kentucky, investigators had already found the answer to one part of the mystery. They did not know that the unidentified young woman discovered beside a rural road was Barbara. They did not know that she had been buried under an invented identity. And Barbara's grave did not know the family who should have been visiting it. Two worlds existed separately. One contained a missing woman. The other contained an unidentified murder victim. The connection between them was invisible. That invisible connection is what made the case so difficult. There was no obvious name. No identification card. No personal document that could survive the circumstances. No immediate relative standing beside the body to say, "That is her." There was only an unknown woman. A body. A grave. And questions. The investigators did what they could with the information available at the time. The body was examined. Descriptions were recorded. The public was informed. A photograph was circulated. But the technology of the era had limits. A fingerprint comparison could only work if there was something to compare against. Dental records required an existing record. DNA profiling was not available. Databases capable of linking unidentified remains to missing people did not exist in the form they would decades later. Every limitation created another wall. And behind those walls was Barbara. Years passed. Then decades. The world changed around the case. Cars became more advanced. Telephones changed. Computers appeared. The internet transformed communication. Genetic science transformed forensic investigation. But the fundamental question remained. Who was the woman buried as Tent Girl? The answer was waiting in another record. A missing person file. A photograph. A family memory. The breakthrough required those pieces to meet. That is what makes the story so remarkable. The case was not solved by one dramatic discovery at the crime scene. The crime scene had been silent for decades. It was solved by connection. One piece of information recognized another. A photograph recognized a face. A family recognized a possibility. A DNA test established the truth. And suddenly, 30 years of uncertainty collapsed. Barbara had been missing. Tent Girl had been unidentified. They were the same person. There is a strange psychological effect when an unidentified victim receives a name. The entire story changes instantly. Before identification, listeners ask, "Who is she?" After identification, they ask, "What happened to her?" The first question concerns identity. The second concerns justice. And justice is much harder. Barbara's identification reopened emotional wounds that had never truly closed. Her family could finally mourn her. But mourning is different when it comes after decades of uncertainty. There are memories that become frozen in time. People remember the person as they were when they disappeared. They do not get to watch them age. They do not see their hair turn gray. They do not see new photographs. They do not hear their voice changing with time. Barbara remained 24 in memory, while the people who loved her continued growing older. That is one of the hidden tragedies of a long-term disappearance. Time moves forward for everyone except the missing person. Then identification suddenly brings the past into the present. Barbara was no longer a woman who might return. She was a woman whose life had ended decades earlier. The realization was devastating, but it also ended the uncertainty. And that mattered. Because uncertainty can be more corrosive than grief. Grief has an object. Uncertainty has endless possibilities. A family can spend years imagining every possible explanation. Was she alive? Was she somewhere else? Had she changed her identity? Had she chosen to leave? Had something happened? Every possibility carries another question. Barbara's family eventually received the worst answer. But it was an answer. She had not abandoned them. She had not simply vanished. She had been killed. That distinction is enormous. It changes how every memory is understood. A missed birthday becomes tragic. A last conversation becomes precious. An old photograph becomes evidence of a life that ended too soon. A family story becomes part of the historical record. And a grave that once represented anonymity becomes a place of remembrance. Yet the investigation could not stop there. The identification made it possible to examine the circumstances of Barbara's death through a different lens. The woman found beside the road was no longer an abstract victim. She was a known person who had disappeared around the same period. Her relationships could be examined. Her movements could be reconsidered. The people around her could be placed into a timeline. And one name remained particularly important: George Earl Taylor. Taylor had been regarded as the prime suspect in connection with Barbara's death. But suspicion is not conviction. That line must remain intact. He was never convicted of murdering Barbara. He died in 1987. The identification occurred in 1998. 11 years separated his death from the discovery of Barbara's true identity. That gap is more than a date on a timeline. It represents a lost opportunity. Had Barbara been identified earlier, investigators could have questioned Taylor with knowledge that did not exist at the time. They could have confronted him with her identity. They could have tested his account against the evidence. They could have watched his reactions. They could have asked about details that remained hidden for decades. But history gave investigators no such opportunity. By the time the name Barbara and Hackman was restored, Taylor could no longer answer. The most important witness against himself was unavailable, and the most important questions remained unanswered. That is why the case cannot be transformed into a solved murder simply because investigators had a suspect. A suspect is not a verdict. A theory is not a conviction. And a strong suspicion cannot replace evidence established in court. Barbara deserves the truth. That means acknowledging both what investigators believed and what they could never prove. It is tempting to fill the silence with certainty. But the silence is real. There was no trial. There was no conviction. There was no confession that conclusively established the full circumstances. There was no courtroom where all the evidence could be tested publicly. Instead, there was a dead suspect, a recovered identity, and a family finally reunited with the truth about what happened to their missing relative. That is the complicated legacy of the case. One mystery disappeared. Another survived. And perhaps the most haunting question is whether the second mystery could ever have been solved if the first had been solved sooner. What if Barbara had been identified in 1968? What if the technology had existed? What if the missing person records had been connected? What if someone had recognized her photograph? What if DNA had been available? Those questions cannot change history, but they reveal how much timing matters in criminal investigations. Evidence does not remain equally available forever. Vittnesses die. Suspects die. Memories fade. Documents disappear. Physical evidence deteriorates. A case that might have been solvable in one decade can become nearly impossible in another. Barbara's case demonstrates that painfully. The technology that identified her could not bring back the people who might have answered the remaining questions. Science recovered her name. Science could not recover every lost conversation. That is the boundary of forensic technology. DNA can identify a person. It cannot tell investigators everything that happened before death. A database can connect two records. It cannot resurrect a witness. A photograph can reveal identity. It cannot reveal motive. That is why cold cases remain so difficult. Every breakthrough has a limit. Barbara's breakthrough stopped at the edge of the homicide. And beyond the edge was darkness. Still, the identification changed the meaning of her story forever. The phrase "tank girl" once described an unknown victim. After the identification, it became a historical nickname, a label attached to a chapter of her life after death. But Barbara's life began long before that label. She should not be remembered only through the circumstances of her murder. She should be remembered as the person she was before the crime. A daughter. A sister. A mother. A young woman whose future had not yet unfolded. There were years ahead of her that never arrived. Ordinary years. Birthdays. Family celebrations. Arguments that would eventually be forgotten. Photographs that would have been taken. Stories that would have been told. The future is usually invisible when someone is alive. We assume there will be more. Another Christmas. Another conversation. Another photograph. Another chance to say goodbye. Barbara never received those chances. Her family never received a final goodbye. Instead, they received a mystery. Then, decades later, they received an answer. The answer was not everything, but it was enough to restore something that had been lost. Her identity. Her place in the family. Her place in history. Her name. Barbara Ann Hackman. That name now carries the weight of everything the nickname concealed. It tells us that Tank Girl was never merely a case. She was a human being. And that is perhaps the most important reason the story continues to be remembered. Not because the mystery is sensational. Not because the investigation contains strange details. Not because the case remained unresolved. But because an unidentified victim became identified. A woman who had been reduced to a label was returned to her family. And somewhere between the first newspaper reports and the final DNA confirmation, one truth endured. Barbara had not disappeared from history. She had only disappeared from recognition. Once her name was recovered, the silence changed. The cemetery was no longer anonymous. The family was no longer waiting. The missing person file had an ending. The unidentified person file had an answer. Only the murder remained. And that final question still hangs over the case, like a shadow that time never managed to remove. Who was responsible for Barbara's death? The years have not answered. The suspect is gone. The witnesses are gone, or their memories have faded. The evidence is old. The road has changed. The world has moved forward. But the question remains exactly where it was meant to remain. Unanswered. Barbara's name, however, no longer waits in silence. It has been spoken. It has been recorded. It has been returned to the grave. And after decades of being known only as Tank Girl, the woman beneath that name finally became visible again. Not as a mystery. Not as an unidentified body. But as Barbara. The person she had always been. The person the world had lost. And the person the truth eventually found. The years after Barbara's identification brought a different kind of attention to the case. The mystery was no longer centered on a nameless woman. It was centered on a life that had been interrupted. That distinction changed everything. For decades, investigators had been trying to put a name to a face. Now, they had the name. Now they had the family. Now, they had the history. But history came with its own burden. Every recovered detail created another question. Where had Barbara been before she disappeared? Who had seen her last? What had happened during the final days? And most importantly, who knew enough to explain how her life ended? Those questions were no longer theoretical. They had a person attached to them. Barbara Ann Hackman. A real woman. A real daughter. A real mother. A real family. The identification transformed a case file into a personal tragedy. And that is when the full weight of the lost years became impossible to ignore. For Barbara's family, the decades had already passed. Children had grown up. Parents had aged. Friends had moved away. Some people who might once have remembered Barbara were no longer alive. Memories that could have helped investigators reconstruct her final days had faded into fragments. A face remembered differently. A conversation remembered imperfectly. A date that became uncertain. A location that changed. Time had worked against the investigation. Every year had erased something. And yet, time had also preserved something. The unanswered question. It refused to disappear. The case continued to exist because someone kept asking about the woman buried under the name Tank Girl. That persistence is one of the defining elements of Barbara's story. A cold case can survive only if somebody remembers that it is still unsolved. The file can sit in a cabinet. The evidence can remain stored. The grave can remain untouched. But without someone asking questions, nothing moves. Barbara's case had people who kept asking. That mattered. Because the greatest enemy of an old investigation is often not lack of evidence. It is silence. Silence creates distance. Distance creates forgetfulness. Forgetfulness creates disappearance. Barbara had already disappeared once. Her identity had disappeared with her. The effort to identify her prevented that disappearance from becoming permanent. And when the DNA confirmation arrived, it proved something that many cold case investigators understand painfully well. A case is never truly dead while the evidence can still speak. The evidence simply needs someone willing to listen. Barbara's remains spoke through science. Her photographs spoke through recognition. Her family records spoke through history. The pieces finally converged, and the woman once known only as Tent Girl was returned to her own identity. But the identification also exposed another uncomfortable reality. Finding Barbara did not mean finding justice for Barbara. The investigation still lacked the ending people wanted. There was no dramatic courtroom moment. No jury hearing the full story. No prosecutor presenting the final evidence. No judge pronouncing a sentence. Instead, there was a grave, a family, a recovered name, and an unanswered homicide. That kind of ending can feel incomplete, because viewers are trained to expect resolution. A mystery begins. Clues appear. A suspect emerges. The truth is revealed. The case closes. But real life does not follow that structure. Real life can stop halfway through the story. A suspect can die. A witness can disappear. Evidence can deteriorate. A crucial conversation can remain forever unknown. Barbara's case is one of those stories. It reached a remarkable breakthrough, but it never reached the final destination. And that makes the story more haunting, not less. Because the identification allows us to understand exactly what was lost. Barbara should have continued living. She should have grown older. She should have watched her daughter become an adult. She should have accumulated decades of ordinary memories. Instead, her life ended when she was 24. Everything after that exists only as possibility. That is the tragedy beneath every cold case. The victim is remembered through what should have happened, not just what did happen. A future disappears along with a person. There is no photograph of Barbara at 30. No photograph at 40. No photograph at 50. No later chapter of her life. Only the young woman captured in photographs before the tragedy. That is all history has left. And those photographs become more powerful after identification. Before the name was known, the image represented an unidentified woman. After the name was known, it became Barbara. The same face. The same eyes. The same person. But suddenly, the image carried an entire history. That is what a name can do. It transforms an image into a memory. It transforms evidence into a person. It transforms a grave into a place where someone belongs. For Barbara's family, that transformation was enormous. The grave was no longer the resting place of a stranger. It was the resting place of their loved one. The years of uncertainty had ended, but grief remained. And grief after decades can be complicated. There is relief. There is anger. There is sadness. There may be guilt. There may be questions about what could have been done differently. There may be resentment toward the systems that could not identify the victim sooner. But there can also be gratitude. Gratitude that the search finally produced an answer. Gratitude that Barbara was not forgotten. Gratitude that her name had survived long enough to be recovered. That is perhaps the quiet victory in this story. The murderer was never convicted, but the victim was not erased. The attempt to erase her identity failed. Someone had tried to turn a human being into an unidentified body. Time almost succeeded in making that permanent. It did not. Barbara came back into the historical record. Her name returned. Her family could tell her story. And the case became an example of what persistence can accomplish even after decades. Yet the mystery surrounding her death still casts a shadow over that victory. Investigators had a suspect, George Earl Taylor, but the legal record never produced a conviction. His death in 1987 ended the possibility of a trial. Barbara's identification in 1998 came more than a decade later. That chronology is crucial. It explains why the case could reveal the victim without producing a courtroom resolution. The person investigators believed could have provided answers was no longer available. That does not prove every theory about the crime. It does not establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. It simply explains why the investigation could not receive the ending that many people wanted. The distinction is important. A cold case can contain a highly developed theory and still remain officially unresolved. There can be a prime suspect. There can be circumstantial evidence. There can be investigative conclusions. But without the legal process, there is no conviction. Barbara's story must therefore be told with two truths existing at the same time. She was identified. Her murder was not judicially solved. One truth does not cancel the other. And perhaps the most frustrating element is that the person who might have known the full story was gone before the first truth could even be established. Imagine the questions investigators might have asked. Did you know Barbara? When did you last see her? Where was she? Who else was with her? Why was her body discovered where it was? What happened during those missing hours? What was the reason for the burial? Was anyone helping you? Did anyone else know? Those questions can be imagined. The answers cannot. There was no final interview. No final confession. No last-minute revelation. Only silence. And silence can become permanent when the person who held the answers is dead. That is why old cases often feel like archaeological investigations. Investigators are not simply examining evidence. They are excavating time. Layer by layer. Record by record. Memory by memory. They search through the past, hoping to find something that survived. Sometimes they find it. Sometimes they do not. Barbara's identity survived. The complete story of her death may not have. Still, the search itself changed something. It demonstrated that an unidentified victim could be brought home decades later. That matters beyond one case. There are families across the world who have lived with the same uncertainty. A loved one disappeared. No body was identified. No grave was known. No explanation existed. The family continued waiting. Barbara's story offered a different possibility. Even after decades, the answer may still exist somewhere. A photograph. A database. A DNA sample. A forgotten record. A researcher searching through old cases. A family member who recognizes something. The future of cold case investigation increasingly depends on those connections. Technology can open doors that earlier investigators could not even see. But technology alone is never enough. Someone has to care. Someone has to ask. Someone has to compare. Someone has to keep going when the case appears hopeless. That is what happened here. The breakthrough did not erase the tragedy, but it prevented Barbara from remaining anonymous forever. And anonymity was never what she deserved. She deserved her name. She deserved her family. She deserved to be remembered as more than the circumstances of her death. She deserved to be Barbara. That is why the final image of this case is not necessarily the crime scene. It is the name, Barbara and Hackman, a name that spent decades separated from the grave where her remains lay. A name that existed in a family's memories while an unidentified woman occupied a cemetery plot. A name that eventually crossed the distance between those two worlds. The crossing took 30 years, but it happened. And once it happened, it could never be undone. The woman known as Tent Girl was no longer unidentified. Her family no longer had to wonder where she was. The cemetery no longer contained an unnamed victim. The historical record finally had a person. Barbara. The tragedy is that the same process could not restore the rest of what had been lost. Her future was gone. Her final words were gone. The full story of her last hours may be gone. And the legal resolution was gone with the passage of time. What remains is the evidence, the memories, the grave, the name, and the questions. Those questions may continue for generations. Someone may reopen the case. Someone may discover an overlooked document. Someone may find a forgotten witness. Someone may uncover evidence that changes the historical understanding of what happened. Or nothing may ever change again. That possibility must also be accepted. Some mysteries remain mysteries. But Barbara's identity is no longer one of them. That part of the story has an answer. Her name is Barbara and Hackman. She was never supposed to become a headline. She was never supposed to become a nickname. She was never supposed to become a cold case. She was supposed to keep living. Instead, her life became a question that lasted for decades. And the answer came only after the world had changed around her. Technology changed. Investigations changed. People changed. But one thing remained constant. Someone still remembered that Tent Girl had once been a person. And eventually, that memory led back to Barbara. The road where the mystery began continued carrying traffic. People passed without knowing what had happened there. The cemetery continued receiving visitors. Most never knew the significance of the woman buried beneath the stone. But history remembers. The unidentified woman had a name. The name was recovered. The family was finally given the truth. And somewhere in that truth lies the most painful unfinished sentence of all. Barbara and Hackman was found, but the person responsible for her death was never brought to justice. That sentence remains. It has survived every decade. It survived the disappearance. It survived the discovery. It survived the burial. It survived the investigation. It survived the identification. And it survives today. Not as a mystery about who Barbara was. That mystery is over. But as a question about who took her life. A question with no courtroom answer. No final verdict. No definitive ending. Only the quiet persistence of an old case. And the name of the woman at its center. Barbara and Hackman. Once unknown. Now remembered. Forever connected to a mystery that time could not completely erase. The passage of time has a strange way of changing the meaning of a crime. In the beginning, everything is immediate. There is urgency. There are questions. There are officers searching roads and buildings. There are relatives making telephone calls. There are photographs being circulated. There is still hope. Then the days become weeks. The weeks become months. The months become years. And eventually, the case becomes something different. It becomes history. But for the family of the victim, history never truly begins. For them, the disappearance remains personal. The unanswered telephone call, the empty chair, the photograph, the memory of a voice, the question that refuses to disappear. Where is she? For Barbara's family, that question lasted for decades. They did not know that the answer was already waiting beneath a Kentucky cemetery. They did not know that the woman investigators had called Tank Girl was Barbara. They did not know that a young woman, found beside a road, had been their missing relative. And they certainly could not have imagined that the truth would eventually emerge through a chain of events beginning with a stranger's fascination with an old unidentified case. That is one of the remarkable elements of Barbara's story. The people who solved the identity were not necessarily the people who had been there at the beginning. They inherited the mystery. They inherited the photographs. They inherited the records. They inherited the questions. And they refused to accept that the passage of time meant the answers were gone. That attitude is crucial in cold case investigation, because an old case often appears finished when it is merely dormant. The difference is enormous. Finished means there is nothing left to discover. Dormant means the evidence is still there. The answer may simply be waiting for the right connection. Barbara's case was dormant. For years, the unidentified woman remained almost frozen in time. Her image existed. Her grave existed. The investigation existed. But the connection to Barbara was missing. Then the pieces began moving. A photograph could be examined again. Old records could be searched. Missing person cases could be compared. Information could travel instantly across distances that once required letters and telephone calls. The internet created a new environment for forgotten cases. A mystery that had once been confined to Kentucky could suddenly be seen by people elsewhere. That changed the possibilities. And then science provided the final confirmation. DNA does not care how old a case is. It does not care how many newspaper headlines have faded. It does not care how many decades have passed. When biological evidence survives, and there is a valid comparison, DNA can establish identity with extraordinary power. That is what happened with Barbara. The science did not create her identity. It confirmed it. Her family history had already provided the human connection. The genetic evidence provided the proof. And suddenly, the woman who had been known only by a nickname had her real name again. Barbara and Hackman. 3 words. But behind those 3 words were 30 years of uncertainty. That moment must have carried a strange mixture of emotions. Relief. Shock. Grief. Disbelief. After so much time, an answer can almost feel impossible to accept. The person everyone had been waiting for was finally located. But she was not coming home alive. She was coming home through identification. That is one of the cruelest forms of closure. A family can finally find someone only after losing the possibility of ever seeing them alive again. Barbara's story therefore contains 2 reunions. The first is between the unidentified woman and her name. The second is between the name and the family that had been searching for it. Both took place decades after the disappearance, and neither could restore the years that had been stolen. That is the part of the story that no DNA test can repair. Barbara should have had a future. She should have grown older. Her daughter should have had more years with her mother. Her family should have watched Barbara change with time. Instead, time changed without her. The world moved forward. Barbara remained 24. Her image remained young. Her grave remained connected to an old mystery. And the people who remembered her carried memories from another era. That is what happens when a person disappears. Everyone else continues aging. The missing person does not. Then, decades later, identification suddenly brings that frozen moment back into the present. Barbara was still 24. But the people searching for her were no longer the same people they had been when she disappeared. That realization can be overwhelming. A missing person investigation is therefore never only about locating remains. It is also about confronting time. Every identification forces a family to compare the person they remember with the reality that exists decades later. There is no way around that pain. But there is dignity in finally knowing. Barbara's family no longer had to wonder. The uncertainty had ended. And yet the homicide itself remained. That distinction followed the case. The identity was established. The circumstances surrounding her death remained the subject of investigation and historical discussion. George Earl Taylor was considered the prime suspect. But he was never convicted. He died before Barbara's identity was established. That fact created an enormous investigative limitation. The person who might have provided answers was no longer alive when the victim finally received her name. This is where the story becomes especially difficult. People often assume that identifying the suspect is equivalent to solving the murder. It is not. A criminal investigation requires evidence. A legal conviction requires proof beyond a required standard. And without a trial, there was no judicial determination of Taylor's guilt. The responsible way to tell Barbara's story is therefore to preserve that distinction. Taylor was considered a suspect. He was never convicted. The case did not produce a courtroom resolution. That unresolved status is not a technical footnote. It is the central reason the mystery continues. Because after Barbara was identified, one question remained standing. Who killed her? And that question is much harder to answer than who was 10th girl. The first question had a scientific solution. The second required evidence that could establish responsibility. Decades had passed. The original investigation was old. The prime suspect was dead. Witnesses could no longer necessarily be located. Memories had faded. And whatever secrets had existed in 1967 had been carried forward through time. Some may have died with the people who knew them. That is the terrifying possibility in many cold cases. The truth may exist somewhere, but the people capable of revealing it may no longer be alive. A witness may have remembered something for 40 years and taken it to the grave. Someone may have seen Barbara's final movements. Someone may have heard a conversation. Someone may have noticed a vehicle. Someone may have known more than they ever admitted. But if that person never spoke, the information may have vanished forever. This is why the silence surrounding Barbara remains so powerful. The case has an identity. It has a history. It has a suspect. But it does not have a final explanation. And perhaps that is why the story continues to disturb people. The mystery was not entirely solved. It was divided. One part was answered. The other remained. Barbara was found. Her killer was not brought to court. Her name was recovered. Her final moments were not. Her family was given the truth. Justice remained incomplete. That contradiction is difficult to accept. But it is also what makes the case real. There is no perfect ending waiting to be discovered at the bottom of an old file. There is only the evidence that survived, and the evidence that did not. The story of 10th Girl, therefore, became something larger than a single murder investigation. It became an example of what happens when an unidentified victim is finally given a name. It showed that time does not necessarily erase identity. It showed that technology can reopen questions that once seemed impossible to answer. And it showed that persistence can matter even when the original investigators are long gone. The people who kept Barbara's case alive did something important. They refused to let the label, unidentified, become permanent. That word can sound harmless. It is not. Unidentified means a family may still be searching. It means a person may be lying in a grave, while someone somewhere is still wondering where they are. It means a mother may never know what happened to her daughter. It means a child may grow up without knowing where their parent went. It means a life has been reduced to evidence. Barbara's identification reversed that. The unidentified woman became Barbara again. Her family could finally say her name. Her grave could finally carry the identity she had been denied. Her story could finally be told with the correct beginning. She was not Tent Girl. She was Barbara. Tent Girl was what the investigators called her because they did not know who she was. Barbara was who she had always been. That distinction may be the most important legacy of the case. The nickname belongs to the mystery. The name belongs to the woman. And when the history of this case is remembered, both may appear. But they should never be confused. Because the tragedy did not begin with the discovery of a body. It began with the loss of a person. A young woman disappeared. Someone waited for her return. Someone wondered where she was. Someone remembered her face. And years later, the world finally understood that the unidentified woman had been Barbara all along. The grave had been waiting. The records had been waiting. The evidence had been waiting. And eventually, the truth arrived. Not all of it. But enough. Enough to give a family an answer. Enough to restore a name. Enough to ensure that Barbara would not remain an unidentified victim forever. Yet one final question continues to hover over the story. What would Barbara's life have looked like if she had survived? No one can know. Perhaps she would have moved somewhere else. Perhaps she would have raised her daughter. Perhaps she would have taken photographs that her family would treasure today. Perhaps she would have become an entirely different person with age. Those possibilities are now permanently closed. That is what murder does. It does not only end a life. It erases every future that life could have created. Barbara's lost future cannot be reconstructed. But her past can be remembered. And remembering matters. Because the final victory in an unidentified person case is not always a conviction. Sometimes it is recognition. Someone finally says, "We know who you are. We know where you belong. We know your family. We know your name." Barbara and Hackman. After decades of silence, those words replaced the uncertainty. The mystery of her identity ended. The grief remained. The questions remained. The unresolved homicide remained. But the woman herself was no longer lost. And perhaps, in the end, that is what makes Barbara's story so enduring. The road has changed. The investigators have changed. The technology has changed. The people who first encountered the case are mostly part of history now. But the name remains. Barbara and Hackman. A name once separated from a grave. A name recovered through persistence and science. A name that survived decades of uncertainty. A name that finally returned to where it belonged. The case still carries a shadow. But the shadow is no longer anonymous. It has a face. It has a family. It has a name. And somewhere in the silence left behind, the same unanswered question continues to echo. Who took Barbara's life? There may never be an answer. But there is no longer any doubt about who she was. She was Barbara. And after all those years, the world finally remembered her that way.